Where will you be?
I have to attend to a matter of state.
Ready when you are.
Reductions, abductions, and mutually assured destruction. All on this week's shadowy episode of I'll Explain Later, the Doctor Who podcast that presents a dismal picture, you might say, with your hosts John West
and Matt Needer. On tonight's programme, the Fourth Doctor gets cut down to size in order to ride K9, but the dog's more interested in sniffing a cocky computer. Meanwhile, Romana gets a vision of the future. A Mockney Time Lord? What will they think of next? We break out of our deteriorating time loop and face the Armageddon Factor. Hello, John.
Hello, Matt. How are you?
I'm all right, thanks.
You're over there.
Yeah, you seem surprised to be here.
Well, I was looking down the lens at our viewer.
Hello, viewers. Hello, listeners.
However he, she, they are doing. We welcome you all. Both the listeners and the viewer. We're here to talk about some more Doctor Who.
We are. Well, I was going to say we're dying to talk about Doctor Who, but young men are dying for it to talk about Doctor Who.
Indeed, yes.
Yes, that's right. We're talking about the Armageddon Factor.
I'm getting pretty excited to talk about it.
I was wondering how long you'd leave it in order to make some sort of that, or Armageddon out of here.
Yeah, no.
Out of here.
I felt very strongly that it was best to get it out of the way. I'm gonna get it out of the way.
Very good.
Yeah, sorry about that.
So the Armageddon Factor, concluding part of the Key to Time saga,
the pulse-pounding
pulse-pounding finale, which we've encountered.
Pirate Planet, is that one of these?
Well, I think we did the first 3 Key to Time stories sort of chronologically.
Okay,
and then
so we really fucked up this time.
Yeah, we jumped around to the end. So yeah, I don't think we've done Androids of Tara or Power of Kroll.
No.
We will get to them into the goodness of time. But today we're talking about the Armageddon Factor. John, do you want to kick us off with the stats?
Yeah.
As you so often do.
Yeah. So you pointed out quite rightly, 6th installment of the Key to Time arc, and it ran from the 20th of January to the 24th of February 1979 over 6 episodes.
Yep.
Of course, Tom Baker as the Doctor, Mary Tam, her final story as Romana.
Yep.
And of course, famously featuring Lala Ward as Princess Astra, who then, of course, went on to play Romana in the very next story.
Yeah.
Is this the last story by the Bristol Boys? Bob
That's
Baker and Dave Martin?
Yeah,
I believe
think
it is.
so, yes.
But it was written by Bob Baker and Dave Martin, who, of course, did quite a bit through the Pertwee and Baker.
Well, and we were
stories.
talking about Hand of Fear a few weeks ago. So yeah, it's interesting. I've got some thoughts on sort of late period Bob Baker and Dave Martin, which I'm sure we'll come to.
Yes, script editor Anthony Reid and an uncredited Douglas Adams,
yes,
whose sensibility, if not necessarily literally his pen, seems to be very much present.
Yep.
Produced Graham Williams and apparently David Maloney uncredited. I'm less across the history of this particular aspect of David Maloney's participation in this. But,
well, it was quite. I mean, the whole thing. I'm sure we'll get into this and perhaps how it sort of manifests, or whether or not, and indeed how it manifests on screen. But it was quite a chaotic, turbulent period for the show at this point. But yes, I believe that is the key personnel.
I think inflation was definitely rearing its head at this point as well, I believe.
And ego inflation as well, but we'll come to that.
Indeed, yes. And I will dedefinitely bow to you on that. This is one of those times when I really wish we had
someone who knew what they were talking
Jim,
about.
Basically, our former podcast co-host and current still pal. But yes, I'd much rather listen to him than listen to you. But we have what we have.
We do what we can.
Yeah, we do what we can. But no, Matt.
Right.
I know you'll be across that. One final thing.
What happened in the Armageddon
Michael
Factor?
Hayes. Sorry, Michael Hayes directed, and I'm just fascinated by his life because obviously he was not only a television director but also a newsreader.
Oh, really?
And had acted with the Royal Shakespeare Company. So he
Triple threat.
went through. Odd job man filling in is another way that you could one might put it. So yeah, what is this about? Well, it's interesting, isn't it? So you begin with a sort of nuclear war between two planets.
Yep.
Into which the TARDIS arrives because their light up dildo / key to time locator beam thing
/ sticklebrick assembly.
Yeah. It takes them into the midst of this war. There's a peace-loving princess.
Yep.
And a very martial. And the marshal wants blood and victory, and there's a sort of allusion to the kind of, I guess, comic book. I guess there's an allusion to the sort of comic book boomer vision of Churchill in the sort of speeches that he gives and all that sort of stuff, which is quite interesting, and perhaps we'll come to that. But they're
almost like war as a pretext for rousing speechifying.
Yeah, exactly. It's the war and the death of countless millions is an excuse for this guy to give rousing speeches and all that
every
sort of
5 fucking minutes.
Yeah, exactly. But of course, the marshal is being secretly directed by a mysterious figure who likes attaching little pieces of square plastic to people's necks.
Yep.
And it turns out that there's a shadowy figure who's basically manipulating the war for the fun of it. The shadowy figure,
the Shadow.
They're called the Shadow, and even the Shadow, it turns out, is simply a minion of the Black Guardian. Although we don't discover that till quite late on.
Our old friend, the Black Guardian.
And then there's this big question about where this sixth part of the key to time actually is. It turns out to be Princess Astra herself. And there's a lot of, there's a lot of running down corridors, logic games with computers. There's a time loop, some musing on the futility of war, and all the rest of it. And the MacGuffin of the key to time piece is sort of there in the background. And whether or not this sort of dressing up box approach to Doctor Who is kind of like a charming assemblage of different things that sort of hangs together in some way, or whether it's something of an unholy mess that can't decide what direction it's going in, will obviously your mileage may vary. But I've probably given a sense of where I land on this. But Matt, over to you. What's your headline on this?
Yeah, I mean it's a funny one. It's like we talked about the Hand of Fear from a few years earlier, a couple of weeks ago, and we were talking about how that had some sort of good bits to it, but sort of had this slightly underlying sort of problem that it didn't really feel it was about anything.
Yeah.
It was a slightly sort of an empty vessel in that regard, that there was nothing really sort of motoring it along, even though it was pretty well put together.
Yeah.
And, had some interesting bits in it. And I sort of feel like this has kind of got the opposite problem in that I think there's a load of interesting stuff here. And also, I mean, it's like I remember very clearly you saying that that the Hand of Fear wasn't really about anything. I mean, this has a political message.
Yes.
I mean, this is very much sort of taking aim at the idea of mutually assured destruction as just basically being insanity, even if the logic of war maybe dictates that it's something that you need. This is all about taking a step back and saying, no, look, this whole situation is batshit, and you should just not have a part of it. So it's got something to say, and there's a ton of interesting ideas, and I think there's some good scenes in it. I sort of tread carefully because I feel like a lot of the sort of a lot of the fans that we that we sort of socialized with, who perhaps are slightly more, I mean, we're sort of, I think, what are called geriatric millennials. I mean, we're basically sort of pretty much as old as millennials get. I think a lot of the fans that we know socially,
my knees can testify to that. Yes,
I think a lot of the fans we know socially are more sort of Gen Xers who have a lot of affection for the Graham Williams era. And I think it's undoubtedly sort of a very ambitious era in terms of wanting to do sort of big sci-fi epics, big ideas, big sort of smart pieces. But there's something about this whole era that I just can't quite get on board with. And I think it feels like that for all the ambition, there's something about just like the mechanics of how it's rendered on screen and just the slight sort of sloppiness and this just, it never sort of lands a particularly dramatic pitch. It sort of drifts around from scene to scene.
Yeah.
Without ever really feeling there's any sort of urgency or drama or anything motoring it along. Now, we sort of alluded to the fact that it was quite a turbulent period. I mean, yes, we know that Graham Williams was battling inflation. So, Doctor Who, never the most generously budgeted show in terms of what it aspires to do. Nevertheless, could do a lot less with its money in this period than it could have done a few years earlier. Plus, there is...
For all that, I don't think it looks bad. I mean, I thought it looked pretty good.
I don't know. I found it very beige and quite boring to look at. And I sort of feel like... I mean, one of the many sort of criticisms, or one of the many sort of sticks that this era of Doctor Who is beaten with, is obviously it's sort of relatively contemporaneous to Star Wars, which obviously sort of fired the public imagination in terms of the visuals of what sci-fi could do.
Yes.
I don't think Doctor Who's playing that game. It's like, I don't really buy that. And I think I would doubt if anyone who's sort of engaged with watching Doctor Who on a Saturday night was particularly sort of expecting that that's what it needed to be. I think that's just a stick for other people to beat it with. But at the same time,
Yeah, it's very much the kind of thing non-fans would have said to mock it, rather than something fans would, or people watching it would care about.
Would flag as a
also,
criticism.
I thought like the basic model work was fine.
No, the special effects, the model work is great.
And that's sort of where I was going.
Yeah, and the model work is good and the effects are good, but it just feels so sort of enclosed and small, and you're running down a similar number of sort of Baker foil corridors. I mean, not helped by the fact, the experience of watching a 6-parter on a run is basically just watching the way they cycle around the same 3 sets again and again and
It's
again,
true,
which is always
yeah.
a bit of a problem. But
it's a suboptimal way to watch what was intended to be spread out over, in a serialized form. I do agree that when you kind of watch the 6 episodes back to back, the kind of dull grey brown aspects of it kind of do come to the fore. I just wanted to say, I don't think that the look of it is really my problem with this.
No.
And I for example, I think in many ways this achieves something. I think that this tonally, this is what Vengeance on Varos should be. So Vengeance on Varos is a brilliant satire and a dark science fiction dystopia that, to my mind, should not be Doctor Who, because Doctor Who requires a moral centre from the star turn, from the Doctor, from the main character, and it requires the kernel of hope that is then nurtured, right? You can have some exceptions to that. Inferno is a good example of a radical exception to that. But broadly speaking, that's what it needs to be. And I think that with the Armageddon Factor, it reminded me so much of Vengeance of Varos, like the kind of potentate leader beamed onto television.
I was going to say, the use of television broadcasts is like striking in this as something that doesn't. And
you really but you've got the Doctor, who's a very fully formed character. Tom Baker's Doctor, a very fully formed character at this point, and he also brings levity. So there is. But those first 2 episodes, you really think you're going to go deep into what it means to be a rebellious mind in an authoritarian system, this discussion of mutually assured destruction. What does it mean to be a traitor if your leaders are mad,
Yeah.
right? And that seems like I was actually kind of rubbing my hands, going, "Oh yeah, Bob and Dave, they've brought it back from the brink after the last one. They've got some ideas on the page." And then after episode 2, it just falls apart completely and becomes chasing down corridors and a crazy computer that can't work out what it's doing is daft and then you start getting mad things like I can't even remember the chap's name. His Time Lord pal who ends up in
Drax.
Drax, yeah.
Cockney Time Lord.
Yeah, Drax, the Cockney Time Lord, and it just sort of falls apart and forgets its thematic meat and starts becoming very plot driven. But it starts to become almost farce-like with corridors and transmats and then just going from place to place.
Yeah.
It drops all of its, it's got all this thematic meat in the first 2 episodes that it then seems to just abandon in favour of, if you sped it up, you could play the Benny Hill theme to it. K9 goes this way, that way, they're chasing down corridors. So I just really felt let down by it. Because the first 2 episodes, I felt, set something up that was really interesting. You can see how maybe, I don't actually know the degree to which Eric Saywood was watching the show at this point, whether he was actually a fan. I always think of him through the prism of his time on the show. But I can imagine how he watched this and ended up pushing in the... Well, he didn't write Vengeance of Varys, but of course, pushing in the direction of commissioning stories like that and working down that kind of...
Well, that very sort of mercenary, militaristic... Yeah. It's a hard-edged idea at the start of it.
It is, but it just seems to fall away.
Well, and this is the thing, it's like that I can't... And as I said, I think what it never achieves is just that feeling of hitting a dramatic pitch and a pace where you feel like the story is motoring forward. And I would say it's like, coming back to the sort of turbulent production, the other big issue that Graham Williams had at this point was Tom Baker, who his behaviour had become sort of quite demanding on set. Apparently, during the recording of this, he tendered his resignation, but the BBC got him to reconsider. He was demanding like veto over dialogue writers, other actors, directors, all this kind of basically completely throwing his weight around. And this is a matter of public record. And he said, his behaviour was pretty shoddy during this. But I do think that sort of starts to manifest on screen because as we talked about The Hand of Fear and even, the Android invasion a few years earlier, like neither of which we think are necessarily like peak period Tom Baker, but in that earlier run under Hinchcliffe, where he's so much more sort of on the leash, he's this kind of bottled power, really. He's just this incredibly sort of like magnetic presence that when constrained produces magic. Here, he does dominate every single scene he's in. He can't help but do it. But everyone else on set is kind of at the mercy of how he decides to play any one scene. And sometimes he decides to play it straight. Sometimes he tries to play it for laughs. There's a lot... I had a slightly worrying thought that I wish I could have slightly got out of my head a bit during this, that a lot of his sort of... and then just saying the thing someone's just said and pretending not to have noticed and sort of looking pleased and surprised. It's like very... like Boris Johnson in places, which I thought was
there's a lot of mugging.
There's a ton of mugging in this, and sometimes it's mugging without anything really sort of funny to do. At other times, he switches up in the middle of the scene how he's going to play it. There are things like, the really lame cliffhanger to part 2, where he walks into the lift and then the other guys. Or the transmat thing, and the guys come out and he realises it's a trap, which is so leadenly directed in terms of being so obviously signposted. And, Tom Baker just playing it in a really, I can't be asked to actually deliver anything here. And I think he becomes a bit of a liability in this, to be honest, because it's like he's so... how any one scene goes so depends on the mood he's in. And that really means that the other performances, everyone else is playing second fiddle to him. The director is having to follow him rather than direct him. And I think it is one of several elements that just makes it feel this kind of shapeless sort of blancmange of just kind of moving around and stuff happening.
I don't disagree. He's still quite a magnetic force. I mean,
when he's good, he's good.
But I know I do agree. But I just don't think that this is the kind of central issue here. Like, I mean, like, it's a contributing factor to this not being an out and out success. I mean,
it's one of the things. No, it's maybe it's not the central problem with it, but it is something that,
because Barry Jackson as Drax is the central problem.
Well, he's only in it for a couple of episodes.
No, but he shouldn't be in it at all.
No,
and sorry, I'm not actually having a go at Barry. Bless him. It's the fact that he's there at all. Like,
he does what he needs to do. I think what he's told to do. But I think that's quite a Bob Baker, Dave Martin thing to sort of switch up and introduce a new character sort of partway through.
But and maybe this is the budget constraints, but, like, you know, if you think about Planet of the Spiders or other 6-parters that we've... Is Planet of the Spiders 6 parts or 7?
6, I think.
Yeah. But, like, you would typically switch location, right? You would typically move into a really big, you know, you'd do a switcheroo and move somewhere else or something. I mean, let's talk about the Shadow.
Yes.
Because I felt really annoyed. I felt really annoyed that he wasn't the big bad.
Yeah.
Because I feel like he was a much more impressive and interesting, or at least entertaining,
yes,
big bad than the Black Guardian.
Totally.
Who just sort of pops up in a sort of
dressed as the White Guardian.
Yeah,
because the guy who played the White Guardian wasn't available as well.
Right.
In there. It's like,
typical.
I mean, it's really the cart is really leading the horse with a lot of decisions made during this period.
I think that's exactly it. Yes, but I thought that the Shadow looked great.
Yeah,
like, I really liked the kind of mask and the look of the Shadow. I actually felt as well that, let me just get this right, who the actor was, but William Squire. Yeah. William Squire was, I felt, oddly unnerving. His performance was probably the most effective performance in this. There were basically, I think John Woodvine as the Marshal is brilliant, and it is slightly comic book, but it's very deliberately so.
It's that thing of, like, you know, it's funny that he's this mad, but because he's so he will do it and he will take everyone with him, it becomes terrifying.
Exactly.
He's superb,
and his sort of pound shop Churchill stylings and that sort of thing. I thought he played it well, and I thought, to be fair to Baker and Martin, this was a well-drawn character. It's interesting that this most well-drawn character is there in episodes 1 and 2, which I again believe set something up. So set something really interesting up that isn't then followed through. But back to William Squire as the Shadow, I feel it's a really it really, you know, sort of out and out villainy. Like, he's a villain, right?
Yeah.
He's not just a bad guy. He's a villain. He's treading that line between being sinister and being pantomime villain. I mean, he does even get some sort of evil chuckles at some point, that sort of thing. And he manages to walk that line. And I was just very disappointed that he arrived when the plot had obviously abandoned the building. And, like, it's a great performance with nothing to do, nowhere to be.
Well, and that's the thing. I mean, there are a couple of scenes in this that I sort of flagged as being sort of unsettlingly and pleasingly strange. Where I feel like the direction and the writing and the performances do sort of coalesce into putting something sort of, I think, pleasingly odd on the screen. I mean, one of them is actually, you know, after the Shadow appears in part 3, and he sort of just lets the Doctor walk away, which could feel like a sort of clumsy contrivance. But the reason he gives, where he says it's like, you know, I'm pretty much an eternal being. It doesn't actually make any difference if I have to wait 1,000 years to actually get the key to time off you, because I can wait that long. It's nothing to me. Was sort of oddly, I mean, I found that quite chilling, actually, as a sort of idea. I mean, there were other scenes, like the scene where I think I mean, one of the production aspects of this I like is that I think the sound design is pretty good on this. The scene where K9 goes in and interfaces with the Xeon computer, and it's just this silent scene where there's a bunch of sort of slightly 2001-esque kind of just clicking and beeping and computer noises, and this robot dog probing a computer with flashing lights on it for slightly longer than you sort of necessarily need to hold on it. I was watching it going like, this is pleasingly strange television. Likewise, actually,
the time loop is...
the time loop stuff is great.
Yeah.
And it's like, and also that idea of the deteriorating time loop, like, and there's a certain sort of will this do kind of shoddiness to all of the stuff where they put the fake bit of polystyrene onto the key to time and it blows up a little bit and some tiny pyro goes off on it in order to how they made the time loop. But actually the simple gestures they have of like just that loop of like the marshal going fire and the hand going down and then cutting back and he says fire, and I actually didn't realize it was a loop at first because I thought he was just firing 2 missiles or something, and then it goes again and again, and then later as you start seeing that sequence elongate and the clock countdown goes down, it's a really good idea and it's really sort of simply and well executed. So, I mean, I absolutely agree that sort of there's a point where like thematically it just checks out basically.
Yeah.
And sort of oddly, I think it's at the point where the key to time itself starts to sort of impinge on the story, which sort of it doesn't. The key to time in certainly the other ones we've seen, I think, is very much like, it's the reason they get there. And as long as they leave with the peace, then, it doesn't really need to sort of infect the rest of the story really. Whereas in this it's like the Shadow makes it very clear in part 3 that he's after the key to time, and that's sort of that I made a note of that basically because it was quite interesting that the key to time sort of starts to bear on the plot of this really. But yeah, I think
it wouldn't be the first time that we've reviewed a story where it goes, oh yeah, and when it suddenly realizes it has to do this, it sort of falls apart, really.
Yeah.
I mean, it's almost like Bob Baker and Dave Martin wanted to write the story that they wrote in episodes 1 and 2, and then had to sort of bolt on having to do something about this key to time. I mean, the resolution of the key to time, you've watched 6 fucking stories, and then it's like, oh well, actually, it has to be just sort of spread through the universe pretty much as it had been.
Yes.
It's obvious.
Seemingly without consequence to...
It's obvious bobbins.
Yeah.
And I can only imagine if you'd actually sat week after agonizing week for this thing to be... I can only imagine the huge frustration that must have come from this.
Yeah.
I mean, I say I can only imagine. I mean, some of the finales in the post 2005 run of Doctor Who haven't exactly hit the mark, but when you've had this quest narrative, Frodo does destroy the ring.
Yeah,
there's a consequence to all of this questing. They do all of this questing and there's no consequence. And I don't know whether they thought they were making some sort of grand philosophical point or thought they were being clever, or whether it was just, we have no idea what to do with this and therefore we're here. But it is deeply dissatisfying.
It is. Although, I do quite like, again, they don't really do anything with it, but that idea of, the randomizer, because it's like, we got to go on the run now or something like that because the Black Guardian's going to be mad. But,
unsatisfying.
Unsatisfying? Dissatisfying?
Dissatisfactory. Unsatisfying. Anyway, I didn't like it.
No. No.
I didn't like it.
I don't. It's not the first time that we've reviewed a story in this run of I'll Explain Later where it's like everything's ruined by the Black Guardian having to be involved somehow.
Armageddon, fed up of him.
Well, luckily, I don't think we're going to see much more of him. I think we've covered all the Black Guardian.
They didn't have the chicken attached to his head this time, though.
He didn't. No, which makes you think that was a nice little design flourish that they had in the 80s.
Yeah, I mean, if we're going to have this bastard back,
graft a dead bird on amidst the hair gel, up at the front. Yeah, I mean, again, it's just like it's not short of interesting stuff. It's just like it just doesn't.
A word
Yeah.
for Shap.
Yes.
Because I know that I praised the characterization of the Marshal played by John Woodvine and the Shadow played by William Squire. I did really like David Harris as Shap.
Yeah.
I thought it was a good performance. I thought it was an interesting character because he wanted to be a loyal soldier, but felt his loyalty being sorely tested.
Yes.
There was also, I felt, some quite successful comedy, again, chiefly in the first 2, maybe 3 episodes of the ships have been completely destroyed, sir. Yeah. Sort of, no, they're winning. The Marshal was saying, no, they've been completely destroyed, sir. And he delivered that nicely. I'm not saying it was a groundbreaking performance. I'm not saying it was the most wonderful characterization, but he was the kind of sort of third wheel foil that I look for in a Doctor Who story. Well, it was a nice little performance.
There's also a sense in which he's sort of trying to use a contemporary phrase, like sane wash what is going on with this, which I thought was quite an interesting dynamic. Like the way the Marshal, and the Marshal is such just a total obvious weirdo, but the way he keeps going and looking into that piece of frosty glass for ages and going all sort of hypnotizing, and the Doctor says, well, what's he doing? And Shap is the one who says, like, oh, he's meditating or something. And it's like as if he's trying to say, well, of course this is what he's doing, but he thinks it's pretty batshit as well.
Yes.
No, you're right. It was a good performance there.
And of course, this is the final story of Mary Tam as Romana. And it did feel to me quite striking watching Lala Ward as Princess Astra and Mary Tam as Romana. I really like Mary Tam.
Yeah.
I think she's great as Romana, and I feel that she holds her own against Tom Baker.
Absolutely, yeah.
Especially given everything that you were just saying about how inconsiderate and how much of an arse he was being, frankly. I felt that she was able to kind of roll her eyes and successfully meet his energy with a different energy that worked.
Yeah.
I'm curious.
She convinced. Sorry, I was just going to say she convinces me as a Time Lord in this as well, which I think is quite interesting. It's like not just for the slightly more sort of aristocratic bearing that she has, but there's that great bit in episode 1 where
it's where most of the great bits are, to be fair.
Yeah, where they're asking, and I can't remember what's the name of Princess Astra's boyfriend. Merak, yes, who's mooning over her.
The Doctor guy.
Yeah.
Sorry, not the Doctor, obviously.
And the Doctor and Romana ask Merak why he needs to find the princess.
Awful performance, by the way. Sorry.
They ask him why he needs to find the princess.
I do apologise, Ian Sainer. Yeah, sorry, Ian.
That's good. You criticise performance and then look up his name to make sure that you can really attribute it.
Forgive me.
To where it goes. But there's that bit where like the Doctor and Romana say like, why do you need to find this princess? And he says, because I love her. And the Doctor and Romana then just do a really well timed like, like as if there's like this isn't a sort of rationale that they're used to having to sort of deal with. So that's a good moment. Yeah, I think Mary Tam's good in this. But sorry, you were going to make a point because obviously we've got Lala Ward in this as well.
Well, yeah, and I just like I think that Lala Ward as Romana much later on, I rate her performance, but there was nothing here to suggest that she would be good in that role. And partly it's Princess Astra's characterization, and partly the fact that she becomes zombie or controlled Princess Astra at a certain point. But well,
there's something interesting in the sort of archetype they build for her in part 1 again, where obviously she is presumably nominally part of the royal family in that contains some figurehead status in this military setup. And she's doing this sort of like, Queen Mother touring the East End, kind of like going to all the hospitals kind of thing, really. But yeah, you're right.
That's as interesting as she gets.
That is as interesting
that, and
as she
she's
gets.
also secretly plotting to maybe open peace talks and that sort of thing. that's as interesting as she gets. But I do feel that, I mean, look, there's a certain aspect to which you can't polish a turd.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure what Lala Ward could have done, but I thought it was a really limp performance. And I guess if I was watching that and then I saw that she became the next Romana, I'd be like, her?
Yeah.
But obviously we do know that she took on that role rather well. But
Yeah.
what were the circumstances of Mary Tam's departure?
I think she didn't want to do it anymore. And
Fair dues.
she, I think she just sort of had enough. Yeah, from what I understand, is like she announced, and Graham Williams thought that she wouldn't leave, which is why they committed to having Romana in the next run as well. And then she went through there. Yeah, I think it's like, I mean, I can't imagine it was a particularly easy environment to be working in. But no, she's really good in this.
I thought so.
She's really good in this.
So this was the last story by Bob Baker and Dave Martin.
Yeah.
Bob Baker did write one more, the name of which has escaped me.
Okay. Nightmare of Eden.
Yes, which was in 79 as well.
Following year.
Yes. Yes.
Season
no,
17.
later that year.
Yeah.
Because I think this was January 79.
Yeah.
Wasn't it?
Next season.
Yeah. So, but this was the last of the stories that they wrote as a duo, and Dave Martin's last. Do they? I mean, they obviously don't cap their era off with a win, as far as we're concerned. This is a curate's egg at best, right? Good in parts, and those parts are 1 and 2. I would largely say. But do we feel like they brought a particular vision? I mean, I think there's a very anti-militaristic, anti-imperialist sort of aspect to this particular story.
Yeah.
And I suppose that's something of a through line in their work.
Well, there's always ideas tossed into the mix from the world around them. I think they're like, whether or not, and this is the thing, I mean, I know we said that sort of Hand of Fear wasn't necessarily sort of about too much in particular, but I think...
Well, I suppose Hand of Fear had the kind of power... absolute power corrupts absolutely sort of power drives you mad, which we didn't really touch upon when we reviewed it. But I suppose if you were grasping with your Hand of Fear for a through line on what that was about, you could sort of, I suppose, plausibly.
Well, the thing is, I think you'd probably say that for a lot of their stories, that their work isn't. The stories are never particularly about anything in the way that, like, the Green Death is about something, or the Genesis of the Daleks, or or Vengeance on Varos, are about something. But in terms of doing, I sort of consider them like at their peak, they're the sort of masters of the Doctor Who procedural, because it's like they can do an A follows B story. For the most part, switch it up partway through, give you some sort of interesting, or give you some entertaining characters, usually like a sort of decent villain or an alien race, but then put this sprinkling of sort of interesting contemporary thought over it that just like lifts basically the procedural. It's like, I'm not sure to what extent they've got anything I'd describe as an out and out masterpiece in the way that I would say something like the Green Death is, but it's like, stuff like, well, stuff like this. I think it's like, I think this is a sort of a fairly boring story that doesn't really work. But there's more interesting stuff in there than you would necessarily expect, given the sort of general wobbliness of the whole setup. Stuff like the Claws of Axos, which I think is way more interesting than it needs to be, or necessarily on its surface first appears on a sort of light watch. So I think they're the kings of Doctor Who that sort of does Doctor Who-y type things and goes down pretty easy, but with like a decent sort of, like, the sense that there's a mind, an interesting mind behind it.
So why does that fall apart here?
Because they write 2 episodes and have to do another 4.
Good evening. Perhaps you remember me, the man in black. I'm here tonight to give you a friendly warning. Do you feel frightened of the dark? Squeamish about blood? Do you, who live alone, sometimes feel that your hairbrush is not quite where you left it on your dressing table? Do you sometimes feel that the trees in a dark wood are not wholly on your side? And you, madam, do you feel that bats are constantly conspiring to secure lodgment in your hair? If you do, I would strongly advise you, as a friend, to avoid this channel late on Fridays for the next few weeks.
So, Matt,
Yes.
we have received
More correspondence.
Correspondence,
we get
yeah.
correspondence on the regular now.
I know.
People
yes.
love writing to us.
They do.
Why don't you write to us? Why don't you be one of these people that enjoys sending us your thoughts?
Yes,
on the
and you
episodes?
too could have the major kudos of being mentioned here, right here, on I'll Explain Later Conversations about Doctor Who. We have received a letter.
Should we do like a badge scheme like Blue Peter? You can get into a number of attractions for.
Yeah, I like the idea, but I don't want it to become an emblem of some sort of police investigation 30 years in the future. It feels like there's something a little too utery about that for my
Fair
liking.
enough.
Okay, so we've had a letter from one Lewis Baston.
Yeah, friend of the show.
Yes, friend of the show, major political mind.
Yes.
And friend of the show. So he writes in, "Hello, chaps. I've been thinking about types of historical story." So yes, just to recap, we went through our sort of taxonomy of historicals, didn't we?
This is a big theme. 2025 has been like history year on I'll
Yeah.
Explain Later, hasn't it? And us trying to get to the bottom of what we want from Doctor Who stories set in the past.
Yeah, exactly. And particularly, off the back of our, I think this was off the back of our review of The Crusade as well, where we had a discussion along these lines. But so, hello, chaps.
Imagine anything duller than saying 2025 has been history year on I'll Explain Later in terms of encouraging anyone for whom this is their first episode to go back and listen to earlier episodes. But anyway, sorry.
I mean, 2025 has certainly been historic thus far, but
True.
For all the wrong reasons.
True.
Okay, so, hello, chaps. I've been thinking about types of historical story, thought of some, but there may just be variants of the tropes that you identified. I think we'll be the judge of that, Lewis. There's a potential plotline for part of a story that requires a historical intervention to make sure something happens in what's basically a present-day story, or to reconcile the events of a story told in the present day with the actual history or state of affairs that surrounds us. Yes. So I'm not sure it's been done much in Doctor Who, but it is in film, sometimes played for laughs. Back to the Future, Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure. I guess Father's Day sort of falls into that category. Not played for laughs, of course, but...
Well, I mean, Moffat, we talked a lot about how Moffat does... I mean, it's not really sort of going back into history as such, but that idea of needing to go back in time sort of to sort something, to do a sort of here's one I made earlier is something that, he starts in The Curse of Fatal Death and goes from there. I mean, yes, there's a sort of... There are stories that also take a slightly sort of touristic approach about dropping in on places like Silver Nemesis, I think, is sort of an example of.
Look, we still haven't reviewed that.
We still haven't reviewed that.
No, and I haven't watched that. I haven't watched that since round at your house when we were teenagers. Get that out on VHS.
Oh, with the metallic snot green packaging that it came.
Yep.
That's like.
Lewis says the only Who story I can think of that works this way is the Captain Tancredi sequence in City of Death, where the Doctor and Scaroth are playing Bill and Ted style competitive setting up. Yes, true. How do we categorize the Atlantis sequence of the Time Monster? Question I often find myself asking. It's treating a legend from a historical period as if it were history. So its relationship to history is ambiguous. That's a very good point, actually. There's also the historical chase narrative, as in parts of The Chase and Spyfall, in which different periods are taken in fairly short succession as part of the overall story. They're basically just the equivalent of globe-trotting plots you get in spy and thriller stories, but using time travel. And I'm still annoyed about that bit from Spyfall and wish there was some way to say why without sounding as if I'm looking for a good side to the Nazis. Good point there. This This might be a growing or future possibility, but there will surely be stories where a historical setting is necessary to preserve elements of the plot for technological or other reasons. If you've got a good story that would be completely stuffed up if mobile phones existed in it, you can punt it back a few decades. Yes.
That's good.
I mean,
Yeah.
it seems to me that basically all detective drama is going to need to be set in the 70s and 80s fairly soon. But, because otherwise it's going to be sort of like, well, why didn't he just check the phone? I mean, it's already, why don't they just check the phone records?
Well, there's a friend of mine who's a screenwriter who said that there was definitely a period where just while we were still in the mobile phone, but not quite in the smartphone era, where just like to have any suspense in a scene, you'd have to write a damn no signal kind of moment in order to then explain why everything that happens in the next 10 minutes happens.
Yes. A lot easier to just go back to 1987.
Well, Doctor Who gives us that option.
It does. Or there's an element in The Abominable Snowmen, which is set in the late 30s, as I recall. There's not a lot of use made of the 1930s setting per se, but it does mean that you don't have to get involved with the post-1949 history of Tibet. Yes, good point. Black Orchid does this in a sociological sense. It's very rooted in the 1920s, not in the world of historical events, but in the social codes that govern the story. Yes, I think it's interesting. I mean, I personally like it. I think actually Pyramids of Mars is very good at this, where it goes back in time to use the setting, but it's not about the history of the period.
Yeah, almost just get a vibe.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that is something that's quite successful. Talons, I think, obviously we have huge issues with the story. I think it's really dull, but which is my main problem with it, if you recall.
Remembrance of the Daleks, set in 1963.
Yeah.
Touch of that there too, I think.
Yeah, but sorry, I was saying, but I do think with Talons, my issues with finding it rather dull, notwithstanding, it's very evocatively using the period, the 19th century, late 19th century period that it's in visually, very evocatively. I would agree. I think, is it Remembrance?
Yeah.
In 63. Yeah, I think that's actually one of the better uses of we're in this time period where these things are changing. What does that mean?
Yeah.
As opposed to just using it as a vibe. It's really sort of engaging with, well, what are the changing, what are the changing circumstances in this social period? But anyway, thank you, Lewis. Thank you for writing.
Yeah, I think we've added. There's definitely a few more there that we can add to our list of sort of historic tropes. There's got to be a few that we've missed there. There's got to be a few that everyone's missed. So keep them coming. We've enjoyed this discussion of just getting to grips really about just what it is that we want from Doctor Who stories that go to the past.
Well, we can
what else there is to do,
and we will be able to pick up the baton next week when we discuss Thin Ice.
This is true. Yes, it's a teaser.
Yeah,
absolutely. We will be discussing that next week. But yes, in the meantime, if you have any more thoughts on the history stories, if you have any thoughts on the Armageddon Factor, if you have any thoughts on, our salute to Bob Baker and Dave Martin, to sort of writers I think that we find interesting, if not always successful.
Well, Elizabeth Sandifer, in her blog, sort of basically says that they start at the top and it's just downhill from there. So, you get Claws of Axos, which is great. And then it's sort of it is just a relentless downward trudge. I think that's, I was going to say, I think that's a bit unfair. I think it's basically fair.
Yeah.
I think it's basically fair. But that I felt this was a real curate's egg. I felt this one was like great episode 1 and 2, great setup, some decent writing. And it just sort of, as soon as they realised they needed to kind of cut and shut it into the Key to Time stuff, it just sort of fell apart. But
we can also add this to our other recent investigation of the episode 1 story, like the great episode 1. So there you go.
This is definitely that.
We can add that to the list.
Okay.
If you have thoughts on this, that, or any of the above, you can write to us hello@I'llExplainLater.com. You can find us on Blue Sky, I'll Explain Later. You can find us on Instagram @ExplainLaterPod. We would love to hear from you. Get in touch. And otherwise, yes, as John previewed, we'll be talking about Thin Ice next week. But in the meantime, have a good week. And we'll see you then.
Goodbye.
Bye.